Howdy. This time we're talking a little bit more about science. In your second chapter of your book, they talk about why research is better than things like your experience or your intuition or listening to authorities. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, some examples, as quickly as we can get through this, and then a little bit more about how to find research or how to start researching your own topics relevant for y'all that's developing those prospecti, individual proposals, and finally group projects that you'll be working on. So we'll be talking a little bit first about research and how that's different than your experience and life, sort of your sample size of one. A little bit more about how it's different than your gut feelings or your intuitive sort of thoughts about the world. We'll talk a little bit about trusting authorities as one of those heuristics that we tend to use, and finally how to actually find research and conduct research, which is relevant for this week's laboratory project that you'll have to do. So getting into this, first, your experience is, like I said, a control group of one, just you, right? So there's really no comparison. It's just your experience, which is unique in itself, and really just your experience, right? No one else can have the same sort of path through life, even with the exact same, let's say, experiences objectively. Two people can get a scholarship or have an injury and react totally differently to those things, right? It's confounded by other parts of our lives, how we look, how we act, the culture we grew up in, and all sorts of things. So those confounds, those unique elements of different stories can be problematic when we're trying to identify a cause and effect sort of a relationship that we try to do in research. Anyways, but research is better than experience for a lot of reasons. We isolate variables, we control confounds, all sorts of things, and we use probabilistic methods. So we'll go through these quickly. First of all, that comparison group means that we're comparing an experience of one to an experience to another, hopefully ruling out those things like confounds, but looking to see how differences, like let's say in a customer service agent or something like that, can really dictate your experience or something, right? Some sort of outcome like satisfaction. They talk about athletic tape and how different sorts of people can have different reactions. Using it versus not can result in, let's say, healing or not, but then maybe different people can then react to different types of interventions like that differently. So you have to have some comparison group, and the more types of comparison groups, sometimes the more sophisticated the experiment or comparison. Some example they use is bloodletting, looking to see how effective this practice was for doctors in the olden days, if you will. If I was in person, I'd be putting the olden days in quotes. But in one case in this, it's, basically worse, or doing the medical treatment would result in more deaths than not. This could be somewhat relevant to, let's say, certain medical treatments now could be advertised or prescribed that could be maybe worse in the long run for the type of disease you're trying to treat. Anyways, confounds are those things that sort of muck up the understanding. Sometimes that can be even demographic sorts of variables, right? So usually what we try to do with things like random assignment and experiments is wash these out, we say, or make them sort of equal across the groups. There's a variety of ways to do this. With true experiments, we can basically wash them out through random assignment to groups. With something like a quasi-experiment we'll talk about later, maybe something like a matching procedure is more appropriate. Anyways, one of the other things that's nice about research is that we can dig deep into these questions. We may have an intuitive idea about something. In this case, we'll talk about catharsis a couple times. The author goes back to that of your book. And there's one study on that shows that, when you actually study something like catharsis, the research shows, or the outcomes show that, there's more aggression when you're sort of mimicking the sort of like aggressive sort of behavior, right? Which is against sort of our intuitive judgment of what would happen, right? that it sort of releases this sort of frustration. So it sort of answers the question that our thinking might sort of lead us in a different direction if we just thought about it, right? And finally, research is probabilistic, right? So it's not saying that we explain all of the situations all of the time, but it can give us sort of a likelihood that something is, more likely than not to happen, or on average more likely than not, based on group membership or sort of standing on one variable. So also, this sort of intuition idea here, getting back to this, there's certain ways that sort of the way we think about the world or see the world, these heuristics, these intuitive ways of thinking can sometimes include biases, stereotypes, things like that, but they can be innocent as well, right? So there's sort of intuitive types of thinking, right, where you're using the sort of gut judgment, and then there's sort of scientific thinking, or what we might call an intuitive thinker versus scientific thinker, right? So intuition can be biased in a ton of different ways, right? Good stories, or sort of a good sell, and we'll talk about one of those. Being persuaded by what's easily available to your mind, what neurons have fired recently, or what just you see more often in your environment. Not thinking about things for the exact opposite reason that they're not present around, easily available in terms of our psyche. And then, of course, sort of seeking out information potentially, or just generally being biased. So that first one relates back to catharsis. The Freud cell for catharsis was that it's sort of this pressure building, and catharsis relieved this pressure, and then you had less pressure, thus less aggression, right? Well, we know now, like from the Bushman study, that more aggression begets more aggression. So the catharsis idea is sort of not as true as the story might let on. So the good story doesn't necessarily win out with the data, if you will. The availability heuristic and a host of others, what comes to mind, what's available. If you ask people what M&M, for example, they choose, they usually go with one that they think of, like red or blue, but brown, yellow, there's just as many of those in the bag, you just don't think about them as much. Anyways, so availability, what you see a lot, what you hear a lot. Summer here, if you watch this TV show, Rick and Morty, is describing something else, which is more of a present bias, they call it, very similar to the confirmation bias. This one being that we tend to believe in things, notice things, think a certain way if that evidence is there and happening together, right? So something like blondes have more fun. If you see it happening together, you believe in that more, and by the same token, if you don't see the opposite or you don't think about the opposite, you tend to believe in that less, right? The confirmation bias, which I just mentioned, is kind of similar to that, but more that you're seeking out information that sort of subscribes to your existing belief system, or your hypothesis in this case. This might be problematic if you're doing interviews or qualitative gathering of some sort, maybe archival gathering of data. If you're doing that and you're looking for cases that map onto your sort of theoretical lens, that can be problematic, right? And that's maybe a more intuitive way to go about it, but not the research way to go about it, right? Anyways, blind spot is where we're basically unlikely to fall prey to these, or so we think, and then thus not being aware of how to prevent these sorts of biases, right? That we should be using the techniques that researchers use. We may think that we're beyond that, right? Anyway, so the sort of intuitive thinker versus the scientific thinker, researchers sort of control for this, right? And that's sort of the point, is we look at comparison groups, we control for confounds through different methodologies, to look at this data in a more objective sense, and really to be gathering empirical sort of observations, if you will, from, as pure of an environment as possible. And another example of sort of heuristics, if you will, or non-scientific thinking is when we fall prey to authorities, right? This doesn't necessarily imply professors. We like to think that we're somewhat of an authority on the subjects we teach. This more relates to celebrities, Instagram stars, people like that we ascribe sort of abilities or knowledge to that really may just be reading a teleprompter, and we like them because of a character they played. So Jenna McCarthy has been used as an example of this for her work with vaccinations. A lot of people have sort of followed her lead against vaccinations and recognized her with that cause or whatever, where this guy on the right, which I can never remember his name while I'm even doing this presentation, he is a researcher on, of course, autisms and vaccines, and has researchers not shown any relationship between the two in terms of problems stemming from vaccinations at an early age. In fact, they save probably millions of lives a year. So there's the two sides: the person you've never heard of that does sort of the peer-reviewed scientific research that has very little impact on your belief system, and the celebrity, right? Someone that maybe you like or look up to, selling something like an idea like that might be have a little bit more power on you, and so that's what scientists have to beware of, right? Is not falling prey to those certain things. So as scientists, we like to consult not celebrities, of course, but scientific sources. So we'll talk about a couple of those, how you find those, what to look for, and then some other less likely places to see it. And we'll practice this, of course, in lab this week. But first of all, of course, journal articles are something that you'll want to use for even the prospective stage, later on the individual proposal, and then the group paper, of course. Your literature reviews should have about 5 to 10 of these, especially by the group project stage. Let's say I think the minimum is 3 at the individual proposal stage for journal articles. These are peer-reviewed, empirical journal articles. So that means that they're from some journal that has a scientific sounding name, like Journal of Psychology, Review of Experimental Social Psychology, something like that. There's different types of journals, and what's hinting at here is empirical journal articles are where they're collecting data, where they have some sort of results section analyses typically. The review articles are where they're compiling, sort of describing, compare, contrast sort of thing, a lot of different sorts of articles on a topic. Sometimes those can just look like long literature reviews. Sometimes they can have numbers too in what's called a meta-analysis, but those are still combinations or compilations, reviewing multiple articles that collected data. So it's sort of a second-order article. Both are useful if you're doing a study on anxiety and, let's say, whatever social media. If you find a meta-analysis or a review article, they will have a lot of different, articles in their paper that they're describing. So you might get a better feel of what we call the state of the field, or where we are in our knowledge of that topic. Each empirical journal article, depending on when it was written, may have a different literature review up to that point. If it was written in 1978, right, the literature review will only have so much. They can only contribute so much with their individual study. But if you get, like, let's say, a review article from 2018, they will probably give you a pretty good idea of what we know about that topic. Anyways, there's also books that have chapters dedicated to certain topics. Usually research books have citations in them, things like that. You want to avoid books that don't have citations. It means it's not a scholarly type of book. If there's no references, citations, things like that. How we find these is typically through Psych220. So we'll walk through Psych220 later in the week. But basically, this is a house of research, right? So you can search through it, just like you do the internet. With Psych220, there's other sources related to it, like the Social Science Citation Index listed there, that sort of tracks who is citing who, or who talks about whose article, back and forth, and who's citing what. So Those can be very useful in tracking down other articles in the field of interest that you have. Google Scholar is also out there through internet searches. It's a little bit more scholarly, of course. Sometimes a little more specific than just an internet search. But Psych220 will really get you into the psych databases. So we'll try to sell you on using Psych220 if at all possible, which will also give you full text and other sort of benefits when looking for articles. These are some examples of certain scientific journals, that are less scientific in some ways. The Current Directions is a little bit more scientific. Something like Scientific America is a little bit more popular press. So you can see sort of both ends of that spectrum a little bit. Typically, you'll want to use as scholarly as sites as possible, more like the one on the right when you're writing your paper. But if you have something from like Scientific America or some newspaper article with some sort of statistic that is striking and important, you can use that as well, of course, right? When you dig into these scientific articles, not the popular press, those will typically have one major section with maybe sort of topics, headers. But a scientific article will start with the abstract, of course, title, abstract, which is the summary of the overall paper, right, from theory to results and discussion, implications of this article, an introduction, literature review that goes through what we know of that topic. So those, of course, are good to read to get familiarized with your topic. Then, of course, the method, what they did in their study, so participants, procedure, methodology that they use to collect data, what we call the procedures, and then the results, where they talk about how the data they collect in that methods are tested to see if the hypotheses are confirmed or not. So those results, the data that you analyze, can confirm your hypotheses and support them, and add sort of weight to a certain theory, or they can, add evidence against a theory. But neither way are you proving anything. You're just adding evidence, right? You're adding a little bit of grain of salt to that discussion. And the discussion section, speaking of, is where you talk about the results and how they fit into that larger sort of, theoretical knowledge base, like I was just saying. Is it supportive? Is it not supportive? What can people do different in the future to make their study better? Or where should the next research go, right? What should they look at next? And then finally, of course, references. So then other people can go find the stuff that you cited and look it up for themselves and write their papers based on that, right? You can also see, of course, who cites papers that are done. So anything in your references paper, someone could put that into, let's say, Google Scholar or Psych220 and see who has cited that. That's a different type of citation search, which is equally important. So, some other places you might find this. The retail bookshelf is popular press there. We don't walk around Barnes & Nobles as much anymore, but that is very helpful to get an idea of some of the authors out there doing work. If nothing else, it might give you some ideas for verbiage, some words to search for. Same goes for wikis and things like that. They may point toward popular authors, popular terminology and phrasing. Sometimes it's just a matter of knowing what to search for. So the popular press can be used for that. We call it the popular press because it's not necessarily research-based, nor will it necessarily have citations. And the authors may not necessarily be scientists. They could be clinicians or something like that. And of course, these are not what we call peer-reviewed. So they may have an editorial team that makes it sound good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that some other expert is reading it. Why we like journal articles, of course, is that peer review process, that we know other experts are judging the quality of it and potentially rejecting it if it doesn't meet certain standards, right? Anyways, I hope this helps you get started on your papers. I look forward to seeing your topics roll in soon.